Rafael Bolivar, Chief of Staff of the Office of the Secretary, Department of Foreign Affairs. Ms. Ellen A. Sana, Executive Director of the Center for Migrant Advocacy. And Dr. Robin Michael U. Garcia, President of WR Advisory Group and founder of WR Numero Research. We are indeed thrilled to be joined by an excellent pool of experts and practitioners. What a way to start this year's activities. We would also like to recognize the following esteemed guests. So we still have Ms. Imelda C. Caluwen, the Acting Vice President of Center for Governance. And of course, we still have with us today Director Gilbert E. Lumantao. To officially begin, may I call on the CBILLS Program Manager, Ms. Zarina Krisha De Leon, to provide an overview of this year's lecture theme and introduce our esteemed moderator.
Thank you, Rhea. So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this year's Thursday Talks lecture series. So, as Rhea mentioned, my task for today is to give you an overview of this year's lecture series. But before we delve into the details, I think it's important to first explain what the lecture series is all about and what it aims to achieve, particularly for our scholars who are just embarking on their learning journey with us. We now live in an era where change is arguably the only constant thing. The world is evolving, and with it, the policies that will shape both our nation's future and our daily lives. As individuals and collectively as a nation, we are confronted with the challenge of navigating an increasingly complex and dynamic political, economic, and social landscape. In this context, the need for institutional stability in the Philippine government has never been more critical, requiring leaders and civil servants who are both agile and adaptable. That is exactly what CBILLS aims to cultivate. It's the reason we are gathered here today and the reason we have come together 36 times over the past 7 years on Random Thursday since 2018. Yes, pang 37th na po natin ito na Thursday Talk series. The Thursday Talk series aims to bring together diverse stakeholders to discuss the most pressing issues of our time and explore actionable solutions and ways forward. It has always been more than just a lecture platform. It is a space where ideas take form, critical conversations spark informed action, and where we, as members of the policy community, deepen our understanding of the challenges that lies ahead. Over the years, we have examined a wide range of pressing and emerging issues. When TTS was first introduced as an elective component of CBILLS, we focused on budget accountability and fiscal management. In the years that followed, we confronted the challenges posed by climate change and examined the digital shifts reshaping governance. We've also addressed economic resilience, security threats, and post-pandemic recovery. Each of these issues requires not only technical solutions, but also a deep understanding of the real-world implications. However, what truly makes Thursday Talks impactful isn't just the diversity of topics we explore, but it's the meaningful conversations that we create. This series has always not been about understanding, but also challenging the status quo. It asks important questions such as, what are we missing or overlooking? Or what needs to be reimagined or rethought? It's also about breaking down policy silos and fostering multi-stakeholder collaboration because no single discipline, office, or sector holds all the answers. In fact, each of you, our scholars, comes from different committees and offices, each with its own focus and scope. Yet, at the end of the day, you are all part of the institution. You are integral to the government. Moreover, TTS recognizes that governance is not just about institutions, but about people, the voices in this room who will carry these discussions forward. And this year, we take that commitment even further. This year's theme, Building a Secure Nation, Institutional Resilience for an Inclusive and Sustainable Future, delves into the intersection of governance and security. We aim to focus on how we, as a nation, can secure our country against the pressing geopolitical and socio-economic challenges. At its core, this theme emphasizes the need for transformative policy frameworks, inclusive decision making, and adaptive leadership, all aimed at addressing the sociopolitical, economic, and ecological vulnerabilities that threaten to undermine the strength of our institutions. By fostering innovation through data and promoting collaboration among key stakeholders, we recognize the essential role of a strong, inclusive institutional foundation. This is key to crafting responsive, forward-thinking solutions that will ensure a secure and sustainable future for all Filipinos. With that, the Thursday Talk series will headline 3 lectures this year, starting with our inaugural lecture on strategic Philippine foreign relations. So, without further delay, I am honored to introduce our first moderator for this year's series. The first lecture of the 2025 Thursday Talks lecture series will be moderated by Ms. Jonaline Villasante. With nearly 25 years of combined experience spanning government and academia, Ms. Villasante currently serves as the Committee Secretary of the Committee on Foreign Affairs at the Philippine House of Representatives and a senior lecturer in the Department of International Studies at Miriam College. She also holds the position of Executive Director for Strategic Partnerships of the Women's Alliance for Security and Peace. Ms. Villasante earned a Master of Arts in International Relations and a Master of Diplomacy from the Australian National University, graduating with second-class honors. She also holds a bachelor's degree in communication arts, specializing in speech communication from the University of the Philippines, where she graduated cum laude. She is a professional fellow of the Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative at the American Legislative Council in Washington, D.C., and the Indo-Pacific Security Fellowship at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies in Hawaii. She completed specialty courses in regional security, human security, and peace building at Fuxingkang College in Taiwan, the Kautilya Foundation in India, and the United Nations University for Peace in Costa Rica. Everyone, please join me in welcoming to the podium Ms. Jonaline Villasante.
With the global world in flux, disruptions in various aspects of international relations threaten the stability of the liberal world order. As an archipelagic state in the Western Pacific, the Philippines is uniquely positioned to influence and be influenced by global changes, especially as a maritime nation. Amidst shifting geopolitical dynamics, emerging economic trends, and evolving security concerns, a nation must safeguard its national interests. Ultimately, as the Philippines continue to navigate these complex developments, it must adopt a strategic approach to diplomacy. This lecture explores how the country can forge and leverage existing partnerships towards more robust foreign relations.
Thank you.
So this discussion could not be more timely, considering that we are witnessing a period of profound global transformation. Geopolitical rivalries are intensifying. Traditional alliances are being tested, and multilateral institutions face growing constraints. Economic disruptions, from financial markets to energy access and food security, are reshaping global priorities. While some conflicts may appear geographically confined, their strategic and economic ripple effects are truly global. In this complex landscape, the Philippines must adopt a more agile, forward-looking, and strategic foreign policy, one that upholds national sovereignty, promotes economic diplomacy, and secures the welfare of all Filipinos. This session seeks to provide insights on how we can chart a path forward, strengthening our national interests while constructively engaging the world. To help achieve these objectives, we are joined by an esteemed set of experts and practitioners who will bring deep insights into foreign policy, global affairs, and regional dynamics. To lead this session, it is my honor to introduce our distinguished speaker. Dr. Robin Michael U. Garcia is a political scientist, a professor, and a public affairs advisor. He is the president and CEO of WR Advisory Group, a public affairs firm specializing in data, strategy, and communications, and the founder of and chairman of WR Numero Research, its opinion research subsidiary. His work in foreign policy and international relations spans research, academia, and policy advising. He was a 2023-2024 visiting scholar at Perry World House at the University of Pennsylvania, where he examined Taiwan, China, U.S. dynamics, and their impact on Philippine security. In the same year, he was named an Eisenhower Global Fellow, focusing on geopolitical risk, data and research technology, and political campaigns. He also serves as a Congressional Research Fellow in the Philippine House of Representatives, advising on national security and foreign policy. Dr. Garcia earned his PhD in international politics from Fudan University, where he received the Dean's Award for Academic Excellence in 2017. Let us give a warm of applause to Dr. Garcia.
I'd like to greet my fellow speakers, who you'll hear more from this afternoon later on. And thanks as well to the Development Academy of the Philippines, Center for Governance, and the House of Representatives for creating this program. And specifically because we know that the challenges of policy making really require some level of familiarity with the issues. And today I'm happy to talk about global and international affairs. And because we're very passionate about this issue and about this field, because as we've always said, and the rest of the scholarly community, in international affairs would say, that the global sphere always intimately affect the domestic. In fact, we could go one step further and say that there's a significant overlap between the global and the domestic, that to an extent, it's inseparable. And specifically in the Philippines currently, we know that we are at the limelight of so many global challenges, and these are some of the things that I'll be talking about today. Okay, so for the next 30 to 40 minutes or so, My role is to give you an overview, a broad overview of what I think the Philippines and the ASEAN broadly, what are they beset with? What are the global forces that we have to think about currently? So we'll try to unpack all of these forces and explain, how and why these are important forces, especially in the next few years. Okay, I hope you can see my screen from back there. So global politics is always evolving. So the global distribution of material power is shifting. And we can see this manifest in the many challenges we have with the United States and specifically with China. No? But since 2008, the global financial crisis that hit the United States, other emerging powers saw that as an opportunity, to project its power, such as China. And that coincided with the election or the appointment of Xi Jinping as president of China, in 2012. So that's a 4-year period where we saw the increased assertiveness of China. We'll talk about that more later. But of course, we will be talking about China a lot today because it is one of the, in fact, it is I think, the most important challenge and force that we're beset with today. But more importantly, more than just the distribution of power, as some countries gain more power and traditional powers decrease their material power, as was produced by the crisis, we also have the norms, the established global norms since World War II being challenged. No? So if we've created norms of sovereignty, norms that ensure the protection of human rights because we were reeling from wars, or that we're supposed to protect sovereignty, these norms, while still there, are being challenged by other countries who have a different set of norms domestically. And they project that internationally and try to diffuse that in international institutions. In many ways, by participating in those institutions and by creating their own institutions. And we also see new institutional arrangements emerging. As we'll talk about later, the rise of what we call minilaterals. Instead of big multilateral groups such as the UN or the APEC, you now see a smaller set of countries dealing with specific issues, such as the Japan-Philippines trilateral, or the Quad, right? So these are what we call minilaterals. These are important because, as I will talk about later, these are answers to the gaps of the ASEAN, the things that ASEAN cannot do because it's a bigger group, and we know that their interests are diversified. Smaller countries are basically gathering together to answer bigger problems. So smaller groups, rather. So these are one of the things that we've seen in the last few years, which is quite new, quite a departure from the past 4 decades of global affairs. Okay, next slide, please. So the question I want to ask, what are the global changes and trends that affect the Philippines and the ASEAN broadly? So it's identifying what these trends are and unpacking them one by one. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. So these are the 6 variables that will affect the ASEAN and the Philippines. So that's the argument that I'm making. It's not extensive, but we hope, but these are the big headlines and forces that I feel we're supposed to understand and analyze. So the first one is the China challenge. So we'll talk about that later. Can you go back to the previous slide? The argument I'm making here is that the China challenge is multifaceted. It is not simply a maritime sovereignty issue. It is also an issue of economic security. It is also an issue of challenges to cognition and democracy. right? These are all interventions that China is doing, not just in the Philippines, but in Taiwan and other countries. I feel that we have to respond to all of these fronts, right? So I'll talk about that later. Second, East Asia is such a big group, no? So it's divided into two. So you have Southeast Asia. We know quite a lot about Southeast Asia and the ASEAN, the Association for Southeast Asian Nations. But Northeast Asia, which includes the following countries, no? China, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, have not developed an institution akin to the ASEAN because of so many reasons. And in Northeast Asia belong many countries that are export-oriented and industrialized. What does that mean for security? That means that they bring to the table their own sort of capabilities like Japan and South Korea, right? So what they do and how they interact with the rest of the world, including how they interact with China, how they interact with other institutions and the Philippines, in and of itself will affect the world, no? And us. So in UP Asian Center, there's actually a specialization on Northeast Asia. I used to teach I was a senior lecturer at the Asian Center, and we analyzed the unique historical dynamics of Northeast Asian countries and the enmity between Japan and China. You know, Japan also invaded China and things like that, no? And China helped North Korea, right? So you have all of those things that we need to unpack, no? But though they're in and of itself powerful as a group, so we need to understand that, especially the issue of Taiwan, which I think we're not analyzing as much. That will also be part of the China challenge part, which is number one. Number three is the ASEAN. Of course, ASEAN deals with so many things, but I'd like to focus on its effectiveness as an institution in dealing with the disputes and the code of conduct. So that's number three, no? And there's an emerging proposal. I think in one of the forums, Ambassador Laura and I did talk about ASEAN and how we can, what type of arrangement we can propose to make the ASEAN more effective. So ASEAN can't just be a debating society. You can't just discuss there. You can't just do summitry. You actually have to solve things, right? So how do you do that? Four, the rise of minilaterals, no? So the Quad, AUKUS, US-Japan, Philippines, trilateral. So these are things that will affect us also. Number four, public opinion about great powers. I feel basically, in other words, how much domestic populations accept the US and how they accept China and the norms that China is trying to propound. So I'll be talking about some data. I'll be showing to you some data, but specifically data on how Southeast Asian countries support or not support China and the United States and their leaders. But the big headline there is in Southeast Asia, mainland Southeast Asia support China. A lot of them support China. And that's a dynamic that we need to contend with, no? And therefore, their electorates punish them according to how much they support certain countries, no? We don't have that yet here in the Philippines, no? I think global affairs is not as important in voting. But yeah, so we'll talk about that later. And finally, the last thing that we need to think about and that will affect the Philippines and the ASEAN is the evolving US-China strategic competition, which so that dyad, that relationship between US and China is important to unpack because it also evolves, no? It's not static, no? They haven't always fought each other, but when they elected certain leaders and they passed certain laws, or domestic populations and their leaders become more ambitious, that's where the relationship evolves, no? So in and of itself, we need to understand the evolution of US-China relations, not just the US itself and not just China itself. Okay. So there are other things, but I think there might be not enough time to discuss all of that, no? But so we'll focus on these 6 things. And I only have at least 20 minutes to talk about it. Okay, the China challenge. So China challenge is multifaceted. and it demands attention to a wide array of different variables in order to have a rigorous and systematic analysis of China. And as we create policies regarding China, we need this. We can't just focus on one area, no? Like maritime sovereignty. As I said, it includes two other spheres: economic security and cognition and democracy. No? So if you've read or heard some scholars or speakers talking about malign information, talk about fake news, and how they're trying to support certain candidates here, that's what we're talking about with the trying to control the cognitive or democratic domain. No? Sige. Okay. Okay, marami to, no? So these are the critical variables of China and the Philippines. But I'll breeze through it and focus on the three. One, we're entering into a multipolar world order. As I mentioned, what that simply means is that there are other emerging countries and traditional powers are going down. So the dispersion of power is more diverse. No? Mas maraming kayang mag-assert ng power, and that creates some complications. We're not yet there. We're just getting to a multipolar world order. The US is still dominant in terms of the military, malayo pa rin in terms of the total power of the US's military. But in terms of the Navy, it's another issue because China is catching up, and it's really investing heavily in naval power. No? Number two, and make no mistake about this, China is a revivalist and ambitious country. No? Not everyone agrees. We make excuses for China. Okay naman siya dito, minsan ganito. No, it's not. No? China is revivalist. No? It wants to revive its civilizational glory. Since the assumption of Xi Jinping into the Chinese presidency, it has already said that it will claim Taiwan. It has already said that that China will need to rise again from its period of, a more pacifist period. No? So that was an express goal of Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping, and that's a third point, has actually consolidated domestic power to support his global ambitions. Xi Jinping has just entered his third 5-year term. He removed his opponents, no, and basically changed the constitution to remove the term limit. No? And so now he's in his third 5-year term. He's entering his maybe 12th or 13th year. And everyone who, including the private sector like Jack Ma, who do not agree with his foreign policy, will experience the brunt of his power. And he masked it using an anti-corruption drive, but really it's really just to get dissent out. So he reorganized the government of China and basically created consolidated power. What does that mean? There's a reason why in the theory of international relations, democracies are more peaceful than autocracies. That's because there's more people who can say no in a democracy than in an autocracy who just maybe 20 people will decide to go war with another country. So the fact that China is already autocratic, it became more autocratic, is a risk for the Philippines. No? So that's why we need to study what Xi Jinping is doing, what's happening inside China, the many committees that it convenes every now and then. No? So these are things we need to look at. Whatever China says, of course, in Chinese, not in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Of course, sometimes they also say some revealing things there, no? Especially when they want to castigate us. But yeah, so it's important to recognize what happens inside China, what its foreign policy goals are. No? 4, there are multiple sources of conflict in East Asia. What that means is that actually there are 3 sources of conflict or flashpoints. So you have the Senkaku Islands in Japan, right? The East Asian, more in the Northeast Asia, conflict between China and Japan. You have an imminent invasion of Taiwan. I don't want to be so negative, but It is something that Xi Jinping has repeated, and we have to be ready. It is possible for China to take over Taiwan. But I'll say later that it doesn't necessarily have to include kinetic power or really physical occupation, because actually it's cheaper to control democracies. No? It's easier to just deploy social media memes and elect a pro-China candidate, no, in Taiwan, instead of going there and spending, getting people killed and things like that. No, so but we need to be prepared because Taiwan holds the biggest island the South China Sea occupies, the Ituaba. If Taiwan is occupied by China, whether by force or by democracy, it will be easier to project power to the Philippines. It's very, very near. No? Ang lapit ng Taiwan. No? Kaohsiung and Cagayan and Batanes, napakalapit yan. In fact, pag Manila to Kaohsiung, ano lang yan, 45 minutes. Diba? Ang bilis. Super, ang bilis lang nun. Ituaba, nasa baba pa siya ng Kaohsiung, right? So we need to think about that. It's not just an issue of rocks and bodies of water. It's an issue of how easy China can do something, as it has done with some countries, no? So okay, so multiple sources. So from the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea, so multiple claimants. You also have the issue of Taiwan and even Hong Kong, if you want, and the Senkaku Islands, no? So we have to analyze China's prioritization, no, among all of these claims, no, that its interest. Number 5 is Taiwan. I did talk about that already, but I just want to say that so there's around 200,000 migrant workers, overseas workers in Taiwan, and we definitely need to do something about that if in case there's actual conflict. But we need to go beyond that, no, and think of Taiwan in other ways, such as I said, if Taiwan is occupied, or the process of occupation will have some spillover effects towards the Philippines. Sixth, we need to securitize economics. We think that foreign investments and politics, or economics and politics, are two distinct spheres, but economic policy is a political decision. No? We don't think about it in that way. We think that we should just neutrally accept any and all FDIs. But that shouldn't be the case, especially in critical infrastructure. We cannot let a country we have a conflict of interest in control our critical infrastructure, like energy, telecommunications, media, education. Maybe in others, like renewable energy, we can trade with them, but ownership is another issue. So we need to create policies. I know DTI has a foreign investment negative list, the FINL, and of course the Board of Investments. There has to be a national security review, for including not just China, right? Everyone, including the US. No? So we need to securitize it, make economics a national security concern, and not just an issue of economic growth or development and poverty alleviation or constitutional change, right? It is a security issue too. Second to the last, as I said, we need to think about cognition and democracy because China is operating in that level as well. No? There's a lot of research and malign information, a lot of recent studies from Washington, D.C. and even Filipino groups, no, who've studied the infrastructure that China has created in controlling the media, Philippine traditional media, and digital media. Right? So for example, content sharing agreements between our state media with the state media of China, right? So these are, and you wouldn't know because hindi nila sinasabi na nakalagay yung CGTN doon sa PTV, for example. And even broadsheets, no? They have agreements with our broadsheets like Inquirer, and we don't even know that. But scholars and analysts who study how China intervenes in democracies have already documented this. So you can just look at these studies. I'm not going to belabor the point today. Okay? So, and I think lastly, a big issue we need to think about as we analyze the China challenge is our own state capacity in responding to China. We need not just AFP modernization, but a a reform and an upgrading of our security institutions altogether. One of the things that we found when we were still, I'm not anymore a congressional research fellow, but that's a program that ended last year. But one of the things that Professor Herman Kraft and I think si Joanna was an audience to that, no? One of the things that we proposed and we identified is a splintered security institution, no? Governance framework. Ang ibig sabihin, the Coast Guard is with the DOTR. You have some of the ships deployed in the South China Sea owned by BFAR under the Department of Agriculture. And then you have the AFP under the DND. And then you have the NSC. The National Maritime Council is an effort to consolidate that. And we support that. But that's a new institution. No? So we need to build institutions, increase our state capacity in planning, in understanding, and maybe predicting. Diba? RAND Corporation in the US was created for that. No? It's a research institution that can predict wars. We're not there yet. No? So that's where we want to go. So that's what we mean by state capacity. No? And get the best and the brightest to work on analyzing how possible conflict is in our lifetime. Okay, so that's the China challenge. No? Sige, we can move. Mahaba yung China talaga eh. Kasi I think that's the biggest concern. Sige, can we move, please? Sige, some data. So these are some of the things that we've done. We call this communicative activism. In our paper, we published at Perry Worldhouse at the University of Pennsylvania. It's really dramatizing and revealing. So it's not just the Coast Guard, but it's also other members of Philippine society, like the members of civil society groups who've launched a more aggressive, more bold effort against China. No? So of course, joint patrols. We don't have a lot of this, but it's starting, and the military presence. I just like to say this. I mean, this might be a bit controversial, but in some conversations with some scholars, China and Vietnam, they are building islands, and airstrips and camps. Maybe we have to do the same. Not just buy weapons and things like that. Maybe we also have to occupy those things, the 9 islands out of the many islands that we occupy, right? So, in order to not just use law, but also more realist thinking. No? Okay, as I said, Northeast Asian dynamics, so this is the second thing, will affect the way we behave and will affect us. Specifically Japan. And in the last few months, we've seen Japan be more active in Philippine security. So we now have several agreements in place, new agreements in place. There's an express plan, in fact, to coordinate with the Philippine military if in case there's a Taiwanese invasion. But we haven't coordinated with Taiwan. We haven't. Our situation with Taiwan is just at the think tank level, but even that is not enough. No? There has to be some form of military to military training. Parang basketball, di ba? Titingnan mo na yung mga plays. So that's the point of why militaries need to have access and why we have to train with them. So that if in case war breaks out, you're already ready with your positions. And I think we have to have that with Taiwan. No? Because whether we like it or not, we will definitely be part of it. Whether we're dragged into it or not. By sheer proximity, we will be affected. Not because of our alliance with the US or the EDCA or the MDT. Okay. Sige. Third, we've always wondered why there's still no code of conduct in the South China Sea. ASEAN is quite effective in economic policy. And it's many ways in which it coordinates economic policy from monetary, fiscal, and that ASEAN economic community. We've been trying to do well with the more political and security issues, but for the South China Sea and even Myanmar, no, we haven't been very successful. But if you ask some analysts, they would say it's because maritime and mainland Southeast Asia have two distinct interests. No? So mainland Southeast Asia are countries such as Thailand, even Vietnam, I believe, has a partial border with some of the mainland Southeast Asian, Laos, Myanmar. No? Mainland Southeast Asian countries don't necessarily have a maritime issue. They have a land issue, but not a maritime issue. So if you're creating a code of conduct for maritime issues, they might not have a lot of things to say about that, and they would probably prioritize more economic exchanges with China. But for us in maritime Southeast Asia, such as Malaysia and Indonesia, and even Brunei, our interest is primarily maritime. What's the point? The point is, in creating that code of conduct, perhaps we can separate the voting, separate the decision making, no, in creating that code of conduct, especially for the direct stakeholders, no, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and other claimant states, no. Because we always have that institutional deadlock inside the ASEAN, because we have different interests, we have different ideologies, and things like that. 4, so out of the 6, so we're number 4. The rise of minilaterals that have explicitly been formed to respond to security challenges, we feel are responses to ASEAN's ineffectiveness. No? So we can still include the trilateral between the U.S., Philippines, and Japan as a minilateral. But there are others. You've been reading about this, the Quad, including US, India, Australia, and Japan, and the AUKUS, the US, UK, and Australia. No? All of them have decided that they have a stake in Indo-Pacific. Actually, there are other countries like Canada, France, Germany, and South Korea who have an Indo-Pacific strategy in their foreign policy making. But these are the countries who have decided to actually do something about it, no, together. So I don't want to go into the details, but just the point that they have explicitly talked about the Chinese threat, no, as one of the main reasons why these minilaterals exist. And that's a big change from the other institutions that have other agendas. No? ASEAN cannot come out with that statement that China is a threat, because it's not a threat to other countries. In their calculation, China is a good neighbor, no? But to others, it's not. And that's actually what I want to talk about next, the number 5 out of 6. So bear with me, we're almost done. Next, please. Regional public opinion. So this is from the Pew Research Center 2024 Global Attitude Survey. So they do a survey on global attitudes about certain issues, so including what they think about the US and China. So I've outlined, can you go back please? I've outlined, I've not underlined, but put a red line on 4 ASEAN countries, or countries near the ASEAN. So Thailand and Singapore. They're especially in Thailand, no, that share that's very near China in the mainland. No? That's 80% favorable, no, to China. No? So 80% is not a small amount. So majority, more than majority of the Thai population are favorable to China. So that affects the way Thailand behaves somehow in international sphere and how they relate to the US or China. No? Singapore too, with a very huge Chinese ethnic population. No? 67% acceptance of China. This survey was not made in the ASEAN. It was so there might be some limitations there, and it used I think a global panel, an online global panel. So methodologically, we should see this with a grain of salt. But at the same time, it does tell us something in that populations that are important in ASEAN believe that China is a good neighbor and it's a good country. No? When we study the political legitimacy of China, we come up with two questions, no, about what type of support these populations have towards China. So, is this a moral support, moral political support? Does China have a good moral standing in these societies, or instrumental support, where they feel that China is a good neighbor because of some material or economic benefits? No? So these are two important variables to unpack. Okay, this is closer to home. This is published by the ICEAS. No? It's a think tank, an influential think tank in Southeast Asia. So we contrasted their 2023 ICS, ICS, yeah, 2023 and 2024 results, no, about how they accept, how Southeast Asian populations accept the U.S. and China, and the results are these, no, 40% support China in 2023. Now it's 50%. In fact, slightly more. There were some methodological issues here. For example, they just asked militaries, no, and maybe some policymakers, and not the rest of the population. But it does reveal an important picture about where we are in our support for the U.S. and China. So, democratic voices are important in foreign policy too. No? Even if it's not a top election issue, somehow it does affect, even indirectly, foreign policy making. So we do have to understand how people, even policymakers, think about the two great powers. No? Okay, and I'm looking forward to seeing the trend for 2025. Okay, can we move? So some results from our own research. No. In our Philippine Public Opinion Monitor, we do have an extensive international concerns chapter. So we did ask opinion about Xi Jinping. It's no surprise that Xi Jinping is not very liked, no, by Filipinos. I'll be surprised if Filipinos like Xi Jinping. Sige. Okay, can we move? Opinion about Taiwan. So we asked them, what do you think the Philippines should do if something happens to Taiwan, if China invades? So majority, 84% of Filipinos think, no, in our 2024 survey, our March 2024 survey, think that the government should remain neutral. No? So this is important to consider too. No? Okay. And only 10% believe that we should support Taiwan. Sige. Okay, Donald Trump. Actually, surprising results. Majority are unsure, no, about how they feel about Trump's, Filipinos to, how they feel about Trump's leadership of the U.S. and what he can contribute. So 44%. No? But the big headline is that there's more, 32% over 25%, who believe that Trump can do good, actually. But 43% are unsure. Okay. Okay, whether the US-China trade war, and especially now that Trump has announced some tariffs. So this is results from our 2025 February study. Believe that they're concerned about the trade war because it might affect their families, no? 72%. Others, hindi nababahala, so that's the red, so 10%. Okay. Hindi sigurado, 20%. Finally, I'd end in this slide, no, the evolving U.S. strategic competition. I think there was already a conversation between Trump and Xi Jinping, but it remains to be seen how China will react to the tariffs and the other things that Trump might do. But if you could look at the 2020, the first Trump presidency, Trump was actually quite hard on China, no? Dealing with issues in Hong Kong or the Uyghurs, in Western China, and the like. And it has always expressed the support for its allies, no, including the Philippines and other countries. But what I'd say is that, sorry, can we go back? Specifically for the Philippines, I think we're entering into a period of uncertainty, despite the Hegseth visit last week, and despite the many pronouncements that the alliance is ironclad. Why? Because Trump is a believer in relative gains. No? Relative gains versus absolute gains mean that they care about getting more from any and all arrangements. If the U.S. will get less in an arrangement, economic or security, they will not enter into that arrangement. And you've seen that in play. The pullout of the World Health Organization, the Ukraine issue, the non-support for Ukraine. They're trying to broker a peace deal, but the headline is that the U.S. is not willing to spend a lot in this presidency. And then the NATO also, no? And many other examples. It's because, and this has always been the rhetoric of Trump, the U.S. is not getting so much and it's spending more than other countries. No? Why should it do that? In a business arrangement, which is transactional, it's not supposed, bakit ka malulugi, di ba? Malulugi ka, ba't ka papasok sa business? So that's what relative gains mean, no? Other presidents are concerned about absolute gains, no? Because they care about the normative leadership of the U.S., like human rights and things like that. But other presidents don't care about that, like Trump. No? So that's why they emphasize relative gains. I believe that for the Philippines, at one point, they will review the existing security arrangement. We're happy that the 500 million that was earmarked in U.S. Congress in helping the Philippines and its Indo-Pacific has not been cut, unlike the U.S. aid. But it remains to be seen how that will be disbursed and the other types of support that we will get from the United States. So uncertainty. We're not saying it's bad, but we're saying, hold on, let's wait and see. Let's look what Trump will do, because he has a tendency to get out of relationships and agreements that are not necessarily good for the U.S. No? So yun lang po. I think the panel later will talk more about these issues. Maraming salamat po. Thank you.
Reminds us of that it is critical for the Philippines to act with foresight and resolve as it navigates the shifting contours of international politics. So once again, let's give a round of applause to our resource person, Dr. Garcia. A few reminders before we proceed. For our Facebook Live participants, you may post your questions in the comments section. Our CBILLS staff will consolidate this for the open forum. For those on site, a QR code will be shared shortly where you can submit your questions. We will now take a 5-minute break before we begin with a panel discussion. Thank you. events in the Philippines and the wider region. Now, we turn to a distinguished panel of practitioners who will share their insights on how we can bolster national security, advance economic diplomacy, and safeguard the rights of overseas Filipinos amidst an increasingly complex and dynamic geopolitical environment. With that, allow me the honor of introducing our panel discussants. Our first discussant is Ambassador Laura Quiambao del Rosario. She is the 9th president of Miriam College and a DAP Eminent Fellow. A career diplomat with 37 years of service, she served as Undersecretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs from 2011 to 2016 and held posts in Philippine missions across Vienna, Singapore, Washington, D.C., India, and Vietnam. She also served as Director General of the Foreign Service Institute from 2009 to 2011. Her distinguished service has earned her several honors, including the Gawad Kamanong or Grand Cross, the Sikatuna Presidential Award, and the Presidential Medal of Merit in recognition of her leadership in economic diplomacy and APEC engagements. Please welcome for her opening remarks, Ambassador Del Rosario.
I requested Jonalyn not to read my biodata because I really don't know what to say after Dr. Garcia's presentation. Parang lahat na nandun na, di ba? But at any rate, it's the first time that I felt so lost in the world of geopolitics and foreign policy making. I think you know that because so many things have changed. So just to give you the context, when we establish diplomatic relations with another country, we usually look at the rule of law, number one. Number two, similarities in our values. Do they respect human rights? Do they consider the freedom of the press? And of course, do they respect democratic institutions? And of course, what is their national interest vis-a-vis ours? But all of these are gone right now, right? Is the United States following the rule of law? No. Does it respect human rights? No. Does it have freedom of the press? No, because Trump chooses the media representatives who would attend his White House briefings, right? So does he even respect institutions? Of course not. He annihilated the FBI and the CIA and the Department of Education. And then, does he have the national interest? No, it's personal interest, right? So should we side with the United States then on those bases? Kaya sabi ko, my God, I'm glad I'm out of government already because I wouldn't know what to do with the government. Okay. We just have to take a look at the fact that the present, or at least the immediate past order, was built by the United States principles based on the rule of law. Just to let you know how the rule of law is so pervasive, there are more than 560 treaties under the United Nations, from outer space to deep sea, from UNCLOS, law of the sea, to climate change, to narcotic drugs, to even the rights of children, the rights of women, and everything that rules us, including endangered species. So in other words, as human beings, as rational human beings, we're supposed to follow the rule of law. And despite that, we did not trust one another, so we made sure we enshrined everything in a convention, in a treaty. And then here comes Donald Trump. He said, I don't believe in the World Health Organization. I'm withdrawing out of it. I don't believe in the Paris Accord for Climate Change. I'm getting out of it. I'm getting out of the World Trade Organization. I don't believe in the rules of the World Trade Organization, but he believes in tariffs. And of course, that's anti-WTO. And of course, when he sided with Putin on the invasion of Ukraine, that's almost like disregarding the UN Charter, because invasion of another country is a basic, what do you call that, is a basic no-no when it comes to foreign relations. So what we are thinking of right now is we're trying to develop our own ideology, and the foundation on which we are hanging our ideology on is somehow getting shaken up or being destroyed, right? So what do? I think you have still to look at what we stand for as a people, and it's up to us to look at that. I'm glad that Dr. Robin differentiated between what he called the moral support and the other one, institutional support, right? Instrument, okay. The moral support or the instrumental support. Because sometimes in foreign policy, we have to look at that. I still believe I'm the old-fashioned conservative type. I still believe in upholding the moral support because without that, it can be very shaky. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that you have to give up all of this because you can look at the instrumental support. Like Jonalyn said, I was undersecretary, but she didn't mention of what. Okay, it was on economic relations. I was basically an economic diplomat, so I pride myself in working with the WTO, with APEC, and all that. So if you're going to look at what I look at in terms of, okay, if assuming I uphold my moral institutional support and I look at the instrumental support, let's take a look at China and the US. What is the objective of China? It is to remove all the institutions based on the rule of law and founded by the United States. They want to get rid of the World Bank, right? So what did they replace it with? They replaced it with the Asia Investment Infrastructure Bank, and we're a member of that. It started in 2015. It has 110 members, and we have donated some money for that bank, which is supposed to be used for infrastructure support. Infrastructure build-up of all the people, of all the countries that are there. And this is where the Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese somehow is getting some funding from. Is it a good objective? Yes, provided we know where ports should be built. Because there's some people, they say, oh, if China says, I want to build a port in Subic, will you agree? No, right? Because you know that's a very important part of the Philippines, so maybe we'll get into BRI, all the infrastructure. But there are some things that we should really be monitoring about. And this is something I think where Congress and the Senate can work on. I don't know, I'm not keeping tabs on this. I don't know if you have a mechanism to review the investments from other countries. Because in the United States, even if you're very, very rich, even if you're a friend of the country, you cannot invest in important infrastructure. Like, for instance, there was one very rich nation that wanted to invest in a port in New York. And the Senate of the US said, no way, because we'll never know when that country will become an enemy. So we should think like that. Everyone is a potential enemy, right? Even the United States, as Dr. Garcia said, do you suppose the US will not reconsider its relationship with us if it's spending more for us than that they're gaining from us, okay? The other thing is this. If we don't have those mechanisms also of reviewing what is a threat to our national interests, or national security rather, let's take a look at the oligarchs. We do have them, right? Although, of course, we don't tell them that. But in the US, sorry, Robespierre is laughing, he's a former colleague. Because in the US, at least they're very frontal about it. Elon Musk is there, right? And you look at his inauguration, who was there? All the billionaires, the multi-billionaires, right? From Apple to Meta to Amazon, right? And even the head of TikTok. Remember Trump during his first administration said, oh, TikTok is dangerous for the country because it holds the data on the Americans. And yet later on, when he found out that he won because of TikTok, he decided to invite the CEO of TikTok. And he said, no, let's not ban it. And he even prevented implementation of the Biden ban on TikTok, which he had proposed during his own presidency. So let's take a look at that. They're unaccountable, even for us. Come on, guys, you're in Congress. You know those are doing their own underground policies and laws, right? Sometimes some legislation benefits some people more than others. And I know that because we have the legislative liaison office in the DFA. We know what is benefiting whom. Okay. So, if you're looking at national interest and the personal interest in the Philippines, is there a national interest? Or are there many personal interests? So how do you build a foreign policy on that? That's why some people, there's a debate now, should we side with China or should we side with the United States? That's based on personal interest. And if China really wants to destroy the US, you also look at its other moves. Why does it have BRICS? Why is it trying to develop another international reserve currency? Because it wants to destroy the dollar, right? Why do they want the dollar? Because somehow the dollar is being used for economic sanctions. So can you imagine if you neutralize the dollar, you can still do trade and you don't care whether the US, tightens the faucet in the flow of dollars. But looking at the instrumental support for China versus the US, you look at the competition because they're competing in terms of technology. Who is ahead now, China or the US? You have ChatGPT versus DeepSeek. Which is better? DeepSeek. You have electric vehicles. Which is better? Tesla or the Chinese? The Chinese, right? And then you have renewable energy so that we can save the world. Who is better? China or the US? China, right? The solar panels and all the batteries that they're trying to build. And then you have to look at their phone. Do you suppose iPhone is better now? Look at Huawei. Huawei is now 5.5, whatever that means. I mean, in my mind, 3.5, 5.5. It doesn't matter to me as long as it can, you know what to do. Okay, and then you look at what I call, does the U.S. respect human rights? I doubt. Trump wants to get rid of the Palestinians. He wants to build Riviera, along the Gaza Strip. And then, of course, is it condemning human rights violations? At least Trump, the administration, it isn't. And then, of course, Japan and South Korea are now both insecure about Trump, especially South Korea. What if suddenly Trump says, okay, I'll side with North Korea? Remember, he likes this guy? Yeah. Kim Il-jung, yeah. And so the South Koreans say, my goodness, what will they do to us, right? Okay. So what we're looking at right now, Japan and South Korea finally might become friendly towards each other because of Trump. So in effect, Trump deserves the Nobel Prize for peace. Okay. And then, of course, you have the Filipino linkages. You think you have Filipinos in the US. Okay, we have 4 million of them. 800,000 have no permanent address, okay? So you have the Filipinos in the US, but you also have Filipinos in Taiwan, as Robin said, 200,000. Do you know that there are Filipinos in China as overseas workers? We have 100,000 of them. So where will you go, right? So I have not answered your question, but I hope I was able to raise a lot of things that you can think about in your head. Thank you very much. Sit down there.
Robespierre Bolivar, who is currently the Chief of Staff of the Office of the Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs. He is a seasoned diplomat with over 2 decades of service. He has served in key positions in Tokyo, Brussels, Moscow, and Vancouver. He was conferred the Gawad Mabini in 2018 for his instrumental work in the DFA's chairmanship of the ASEAN during its 50th anniversary. He played a key role in crafting the DFA National Security Strategic Plan 2017-2022, a cornerstone in operationalizing the country's independent foreign policy. Please welcome Mr. Robespierre Bolivar.
Magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat. Thank you, Ms. Jonalyn, for the kind introduction. This is probably my 3rd or my 4th interaction with the CBILLS program. 3 times when I was Deputy Chief of Mission at our Philippine Embassy in Tokyo. 1 time actually during the pandemic, naging online yung inyong interaction with GRIPS. At during those 3 times I was in Tokyo, mas madali po yung trabaho ko. I just had to do the welcome remarks. Ngayon po, pinahirapan ako ng DAP to follow the excellent presentation of Dr. Robin Garcia and of course the excellent intervention of my former boss, Ambassador Lula del Rosario. But after Dr. Garcia's excellent introduction to the global landscape, allow me to provide our context. I think the context that we might need in order for us to more appreciate the global landscape that was given to us during that lecture. And allow me to start off with this adage that we as foreign policy practitioners have always kept in our hearts. Foreign policy is an extension of domestic policy. Everything has to proceed from the national interest. And when you say leveraging national interest, if I may tweak that, instead of leveraging national interest is the starting point of our foreign policy. Kaya po, we can navigate these global shifts is because we have the ballaste po sa ating ship of state, which is national interest. It is both the ballast and the compass that we use to guide us in navigating these global shifts. Napansin ko po, no, over the last year, I've been with the Office of the Secretary, and he has spoken to a couple of international conferences, Shangri-La Dialogue, Raisina Dialogue in New Delhi recently, and in several engagements in Europe and Asia, and I think even South America. Palagi po ang title, Global Shifts, Shifting Sands, Turbulent Waters, Turbulent World. Parang nakakatakot, di ba? Parang gusto ko nang mag-retire. At sige, parang si Ambalula na lang, I'll join the academe so I can speak my mind and then bahala na kayo dyan sa government. But again, how do we navigate these? We have to bear in mind, no, yung po ang ating kailangan sa loobin, yung national interest. Ano po yun? Sabi nga ni Ambalula, how do we define national interest? It's such an ephemeral concept. But we have guiding documents which we can use to define our national interest. Of course, there's the Philippine Constitution, saligang batas. Diyan po nakaangkla lahat ng ating mga pronouncements, policies. In fact, di ba po, pagka nagkaroon tayo ng batas, pag nagkaroon tayo ng mga controversies, tanong sa Supreme Court, is it constitutional? So saligang batas po, kailangan nasa puso natin yung saligang batas. We have ambition natin 2040, the roadmap for Philippine development. At nakalagay po doon, even if you just read the first few pages, what do we aspire for as a people? And those are the kinds of guideposts that we need in order for us to have an effective foreign policy. At yun po ang naging gabay namin when we were crafting the National Security Strategic Plan and the DFA Strategic Plan when we started since 2009, I think, or 2010. And we have renewed it every administration. We just, iti-tweak nyo lang po yan eh. We tweak our strategy, we tweak our tactics, we tweak the direction of a foreign policy, but the ballast, the compass remains the same. Is the national interest. At of course, as I mentioned din po kanina, aside from the national interest, now we have what we call, we developed recently what we call the soft power roadmap. Ano po yung soft power roadmap? Kasi po, we've been, most of the discussions that we've had so far are about hard power, military, political influence. Even economic now can be classified as hard power because of tariffs, because of sanctions, etc. Soft power, we project our values overseas to create an environment which is friendly to Philippine national interests. Example, sino po dito ang mahilig sa Japanese food? Wala? Walang mahilig sa Japanese food? Ayan. Sino po nanonood ng Korean telenovelas? Ayan, no, di ba? Ang dami. Soft power. So yun po ang kailangan natin gawin ngayon so that we create an international environment that is friendly to the pursuit of our national interests overseas. And that's where your foreign policy, your new foreign policy will be the direction that we will take. Kagaya po nung, I think a couple of years back, mayroon po tayong effort to promote our telenovela, yung mga Philippine telenovelas. And mukhang maraming audience, I think, in some parts of Asia, even as far as the Middle East and Africa. I've read reports that there are demands for Philippine telenovelas. So those kinds of things, hindi naman puro telenovela, ano po, we also promote literature, etc., our values, po. But just to give you an idea, a context of how we are managing our foreign policy, our foreign relations in the modern age. National interest, the ballast of our ship of state, our compass, and then we balance also at the same time our hard diplomacy, our soft diplomacy. But all of this, of course, is to create an international environment which is friendly to the pursuit of Philippine national interests overseas. Maraming salamat po.
And representative in migration-related forums in the Philippines and abroad. Her expertise includes advocacy, policy lobbying, capacity building, and training on migrants' rights, access to justice, and migration governance. She has conducted training programs for migrant groups, trade unions, civil society organizations, and diplomats. She has also worked with the DFA's cadetship program and the Overseas Workers Welfare Administration's pre-departure orientation for labor attachés and welfare officers. Ms. Sana holds a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from the Central Colleges of the Philippines. She has also completed specialized programs on human rights and migrants' rights from Equitas in Canada and the Diplomacy Training Program at the University of New South Wales in Australia. Please welcome Ms. Ellen Sana.
Thank you, Ms. Jonah, for the introduction. Magandang hapon po. Sana'y gising pa kayo. Ako po'y kinakabahan. Ako ang huling tagapagsalita. And I'm trying to listen. I tried to listen intently to the presentation of Dr. Garcia. Nagno-nosebleed po ako kasi iba yung mundong ginagalawan ko. At any rate, let me also explain the context of the work that I do and how this impacts on foreign relations. No? So the government's labor export program is more than 50 years old. It was started by Marcos Jr. and is now being continued by Marcos Sr. and is now being continued by Marcos Jr. under a more hostile, fragile, legal, social, and economic environment as the world grapples with rising inequality within and between nations. This further increases the vulnerability of our OFWs, particularly women OFWs, who are disproportionately concentrated in elementary occupation like domestic work, characterized by low wages, much lower in fact than the floor level salaries in the host countries, limited or no access to social protection and denial of their basic labor rights and human rights. The other layer of vulnerability, of course, is immigration status. This despite the overwhelming evidence that migrants contribute immensely to the development of countries of destination and the Philippines, with much of the accompanying social cost to it being on us, in our communities, on the families left behind, and the OFWs themselves. OFWs and other Filipinos abroad are present in more than 200 countries and territories. The biggest numbers are in North America for permanent Filipinos and in Asia for almost 80% of our OFWs, foremost in the GCC, Southeast and East Asia. We also have significant numbers in Europe, the rest of the Western Hemisphere, in the Pacific, Oceania, and in Africa. That said, it goes without saying that the evolving geopolitical tensions and conflicts across the globe, as mentioned by Dr. Garcia, not only in our region, impact not only on our national, political, and economic security, but on human security for our millions of OFWs, most of whom are separated from their families and loved ones and support networks. Our OFWs have had their share of these open wars and conflicts, such as in the Iran-Iraq war in the 1990s, the wars in Iraq, Libya, Lebanon, Syria in 2000, in recent times, the wars in the Ukraine and Gaza, and the military retake over in Myanmar. Cognizant of this situation, which for the most part is out of our control, our government has developed over the years a crisis management system or protocol where a composite team is always on standby to rescue and evacuate our OFWs and if and when necessary to bring them home. In fact, the Philippine government was lauded by the International Organization for Migration for its orderly repatriation during the Lebanon War in 2006. Fast forward 2015-2016, the Philippine government was tasked by the United Nations to tandem with the United States to develop the Migrants in Countries in Crisis framework for the global community to respond to political conflicts to ensure that migrants are out of harm's way. At the ASEAN level, the Philippines was instrumental in the 2007 ASEAN Declaration on the Protection of Migrant Workers. 10 years later in Manila, it also adopted the non-binding ASEAN Consensus on the Protection of Migrant Workers. In 2023, ASEAN also adopted the ASEAN Declaration on the Protection of Migrant Workers and Family Members in Crisis Situations. In all of this, international cooperation is crucial and a must. But I must also add that apart from these wars and tensions instigated and brought about by the warring powers that be for political and economic control, we will be remiss if we will not mention the issues that I believe matter more to people and migrants, like the health emergencies of COVID-19 pandemic, the proportion of pandemic proportion, SARS, Ebola, etc. There's also climate change, the emergence of digital technology, demographic shifts, and urbanization. These issues are equally relevant to the extent that they impact adversely on their safety, livelihood, and well-being, and yet it takes endless debates and negotiations to move the issues forward because of the sheer lack of political will by governments. Wars and conflicts and the players behind these, like China and the US, are relevant for sure. And social media ensures that these take the headlines and become the dominant narrative rather than the issue of climate change, for example, and how this impacts on food security or how we must address the challenges and maximize the opportunities from artificial intelligence and digital technology to make sure that workers adapt to it and are not replaced because they are not technology enabled. It actually appears like we are going backwards. So parang, imbis na forward, parang backwards. As we witness again these tensions between superpowers with the non-superpower global south as the battlefield. The new dimension, of course, is the technology not only for sophisticated killing machines, but also in propagating lies and deception and conditioning the minds of people about what is happening around us. If this were so, then I guess we also need to go back to the basics and assert that occupations and colonial relations between countries and nations are things of the past, and that big or small, the world is composed of sovereign countries with equal voting rights in the UN and ILO. Of course, although may veto power yung permanent members of the National Security Council. I do not know the status of the non-aligned movement and the group of 77, now with 134 member countries. But it would be good to see these movements of nations and countries from the global south, including the ASEAN, making themselves visible and relevant in these times. In 2004, during the Iraq invasion, PGMA yielded to the demand to withdraw from the coalition of the willing and recalled the Filipino soldiers in Iraq to effect the release of Angelo de la Cruz, an OFW truck driver who was kidnapped in Iraq. In this case, it is clear that our alignment with the United States actually put our OFWs at risk as war collaterals. In conclusion, it would do well for the country to be friends with all, and not only with a few, especially with the aggressive few. The Philippines should keep its leadership role in pushing for rights-based framework of cooperation between and amongst nations, be it in attaining the SDGs or the GCM objectives. But at the end of the day, as foreign policy is the flip side of domestic policy, the Philippines must exert serious efforts to strengthen government institutions, deliver its people from destitution and inequality by creating and enabling legal, social, social and economic environment in the country under a government that is transparent and accountable. I thank you.
Our speakers for their compelling opening statements. May I ask Dr. Robin to join us on stage for the panel discussion. Presentation of Dr. Robin. So I will align our discussion on the three pillars of the Philippine foreign policy, which is national security, economic diplomacy, and the protection of overseas Filipinos. So for the first part, I would like to address my question on national security to Dr. Robin. So Dr. Garcia, following your earlier presentation and the recent visit of U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, there has been a growing emphasis on deterrence as a core principle of the recalibrated U.S.-Philippine alliance. In your view, how critical is deterrence in the strategic environments that you have discussed earlier? And what are the major challenges the Philippines must address to operationalize this policy?
Thank you, Jonna. Thank you for the question. It's important, actually. Deterrence is such a big term. And there are several things we could do to deter other countries who could behave aggressively towards us. So the alliance is one. Of course, also the material benefits we get from that alliance is important. And then we can go on and on about the types of submarines we need to get, that we need to invest in the Navy instead of the Army, and then we need to activate the 9 EDCA sites to some extent. No? So there's a big discussion on that. But I also want to talk about the cognitive aspect of deterrence. So there's a concept called resolve, no? Meaning that if, like Vietnam, basically, they beat 2 superpowers, big powers. No, the most recent was the United States, not so recent, but because the Vietnamese had resolve, they were willing to die and fight, and eventually that just tired the U.S. out, and just they left, and they ended the Vietnam War. So I think resolve is important. No, it's sort of a condition, a social condition, a shared. Parang cognitive condition that we're willing to defend the Philippines. That we are, we all agree that whatever a country is doing is a threat. But if we cannot even agree that one country is a threat, no, then we will not have resolve. And it's important that your president express that resolve and not say in Sona that I cannot fight you. Even if it's true that you cannot, you have to say that you can fight. You cannot be defeatist. Because then that will be part of the calculation of that other country. So resolve is tied to deterrence. No? It's a cognitive game also. Diba? Kung isipin ng China, kaya pala, lalaban pala itong mga Pilipino hanggang dulo. Diba? So, kung hindi, kaya mo i-divide, butuin na lang nila yung iba, tapos yung iba, titigil na, yung iba, lalaban. Right? So, I think that is also an aspect we need to be thinking about, just to maybe put a bit more flavor to the discussion. Salamat.
Okay. Yes, thank you, Dr. Robin, because this is an issue that is also dividing the Filipinos because some believes and they do not agree with the stationing of the U.S. military equipment here in the Philippines because as you also mentioned in your earlier presentation, they believe that it will drag us into war. But as you also explained in your presentation, we are near Taiwan, the Korean Peninsula. So these geopolitical issues are surrounding the Philippines, and it is really important, as emphasized by Secretary Gibochidoro and the U.S. Secretary of Defense, the importance of deterrence for the Philippines. And yes, you have mentioned, that is correct, that hindi lang dapat na meron kang mga military equipment. Kailangan, alam nung kalaban mo na handa kang gamitin ito at handa kang lumaban, di ba? And so, on a different, a similar note, I would like to address my question on geopolitical alignment to our representative from the Department of Foreign Affairs, Chief of Staff Bolivar. So, sir, in the light of intensifying competition among major powers, how can the Philippines effectively balance its geopolitical alignments? In pursuing this balance, how can the country assert its strategic autonomy and safeguard national interests while continuing to nurture and sustain vital partnerships, such as our partnership with China?
Thank you for the question po. No? Siguro, if I may latch on to a few words in the question, I would rather use the word partnership than alignment. Alignment, although we are treaty allies with the United States, and we are strategic partners with several countries, including Vietnam, Australia, Japan, etc. But alliance has a military flavor.
Yes, mutual defense
Diba?
treaties.
And when we talk of global alignments, kasi po yung nakita natin sa news, US-China strategic rivalry, as Dr. Garcia mentioned, it's dominating the news. So people tend to have some sort of dichotomy na ito US ka lang or China ka lang. When in fact, as the Philippines, we have several partners. In fact, we have been spending decades cultivating various partnerships. One experience in particular I note when I was serving in Brussels to our mission to the European Union. We were promoting Philippine economic interests in the European Union. It's a big market. And when we got GSP plus privileges from the European Union, and now we're starting up the FTA talks again, so andun po, doing that to secure our economic interests and veering away from the dichotomy of a US-China alignment na pagkampi ka ng China, kalaban ka ng US or vice versa. Kasi po nagkakaroon tayo minsan ng ganong klaseng parang tunnel vision. Di ba po? Japan is our biggest donor for official development assistance, which is not known to a lot of people. They just think, kasi may US dyan, may Chinese investment dyan, yung build is Chinese funded. But it's actually Japan who is the biggest. And if I may say, most trusted donor to these PPPs, yung public-private partnership natin, etc. So those things, we have been cultivating that despite what's going on in the headlines, despite what kung ano po yung ginagawa ng US and China, positioning themselves with their spheres of influence, etc. But we as the Philippines, since we are guided by national interest, we are guided by our mantra na, sabi nga ni ma'am, friends to all, di ba? Kasi dahil pag national, sabi nga nila, there are no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. So, not to say na parang balimbing ka, no, and all that, but in the pursuit of your national interest, you have to find where it is most efficient, most valuable, so you maintain partnerships with everyone. In fact, even up to, as of to now, Secretary Manalo, last year, we launched, under Secretary Manalo's leadership, we launched a renewed partnership with Africa, because we know that there are a lot of maybe investment opportunities. There are an increasing number of Filipinos in Africa. We are now looking at other non-traditional partners. Of course, we have our traditional partners, the United States, European Union, Japan, Korea, Australia, Canada, but we are looking at diversifying the field, expanding our horizons. So we're looking at South America, we're looking at Africa, we're looking at the Middle East, we're looking at bolstering our presence in the South Pacific, which is why this year we are opening our embassy in Fiji. So the first resident embassy in the South Pacific. Not just because we want to maintain a presence in the South Pacific, so we have Fiji, and because we have a lot of Filipinos there. Fiji is also the headquarters of the Pacific Islands Forum, and we want to renew and revitalize our partnership with them. In fact, last year we held a summit on health. After the COVID pandemic, health is very important. So we convened a summit on health with the Pacific Island countries. So now, this year, before the end of the year, we will have a resident embassy in Fiji. So yun po. So partnerships more than alignment, which we have been doing constantly over the decades. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. It's nice to know that you mentioned about the Pacific, because we have the same interest, being most of the countries in the Pacific are also maritime states. So we have the same interest and position on particular issues such as disaster risk management and also climate change. So now, moving on from national security to economic diplomacy. Of course, we have, as mentioned by Ambassador Lula, she was Undersecretary for Economic Diplomacy of the Department of Foreign Affairs. Amba, now we have this a trend that foreign aid has been significantly increasing in the past years. Decreasing. For example, China, Ambassador, its foreign aid steadily declined in the last 7 years. This is according to a study by the Lowy Institute. And of course, as you have also mentioned in your opening remarks, the U.S. In fact, abolished its aid agency. And then Europe, grappling with their domestic challenges, are also under pressure to rethink about their international commitments. So in the light of this shrinking aid environment, how can the Philippines adapt, and what strategies can we pursue to enhance our economic resilience and competitiveness in an increasingly constrained and contested global landscape?
Let's go back 30 years. Remember, FVR said trade, not aid. As Robespierre said, they're trying to do everything to expand our relations with other countries, and I think this is not because of political issues, but rather of economic. I never believe in aid because I never want to appear poor, even if I'm poor, all right? I would rather that, I give you a product, I cooperate with you. But then, of course, trade has a price. I mean, you have to follow the rules, right? Because otherwise the businesses wouldn't want to invest in your country if your rules keep on changing. And I think that's something that they don't like about us, right? Paiba-iba daw yung mga rules natin. The other one is, like for instance, Robespierre said that we have revived our free trade agreement negotiations with EU. Do you know how it started? It started with the GSP, and it started when I was still in the DFA. But the basic assumption was, do not violate human rights. This is the EU, because we will open our markets for you. And open they did. Until, of course, the previous president came and violation of human rights were committed left and right. So they suspended that. There was even a debate at that time within the Department of Foreign Affairs. And I was in the middle of the debate. One of the assistant secretaries said, why should we allow another country to dictate what we should do at home? Meaning, why don't they should get involved in our human rights? So I debated in front of the Secretary of Foreign Affairs at the time, Albert Del Rosario. And I said, you know what? I said, you can say that because you're in government. Because when human rights violations are committed, they're not committed against you. In the future, I said, you'll be a citizen, a normal citizen. As a future normal citizen, I said, I would rather have another country look into the human rights violations of my government right? Because you'll never know, your salvation might belong to another country. I mean, they might be the one who can pressure your government to behave. And true enough, somehow, I think that the GSP violation and the provision, it somehow also softened the position in terms of whatever violations were being done then by the Duterte administration. They somehow put some kind, they tried to withdraw somewhat, just so the GSP will not be totally suspended. And to me, that's my role, is economic political. And then also, of course, sorry, mahabang sagot. I can occupy 1 hour. Sige, Jonah, doon na lang muna.
Don't worry, ma'am. We have an open forum so you can continue to discuss about economic diplomacy. And by the way, I remember because GSP Plus was mentioned, you negotiated with the GSP, and when it was we're about to be suspended, there is a delegation from the House of Representatives who went to Brussels to lobby with the European Union, so we won't get suspended. Yes, ma'am. Okay, thank you, ma'am. And now from economic diplomacy, we'll go to the protection of overseas Filipinos. So of course, I will direct the question to our expert, Executive Director Sana. So ma'am, how are these global developments impacting the safety, rights, and overall welfare of our overseas Filipinos, especially those in more vulnerable areas? In navigating these challenges, how can the Philippines strategically harness international cooperation to protect our overseas Filipinos?
Thank you, Ms. Jonah, for the question. I think some parts I already addressed in my opening statement, pero siguro just to elaborate. First off, I'd like to adapt yung sinasabi ni Robespierre na baka in terms of international cooperation, alignment ay partnership din, but I will also add solidarity. We need to have a lot of solidarity between and amongst nations and between amongst migrants, for example, because, for example, as what's happening in the US now, akala nung mga ibang migrants with green card status or na naging American citizen na safe na sila. But then, of course, that legal document does not guarantee anything. Pagdating kay Trump, parang depende sa paggising niya po nung kanyang gagawin. So I think it's quite important that migrants realize the need for solidarity between amongst the communities there. And I'm happy to note, of course, that in the case of the US, malaki ang naging bahagi rin ng migrant Filipinos sa pag-strengthen ng resistance in the communities against anti-migrant policies of the US, not only under the Trump administration. But I think the way to compel particularly destination countries to guarantee protection for the migrants, for our OFWs in particular, is really to make that compelling argument that migrants, of course, the other side, we always say this, especially if the audience is Filipino or our government, we go abroad out of necessity because we lack the opportunities for decent jobs, blah, 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 blah. But I think we also need to put the other side, the other narrative, the other half of that narrative, that many countries around the globe, like in Asia, that's why we have 80% of our OFWs are in Asia, they have acute labor shortage. Their economies will collapse if not for the migrant labor. So I think we need to put that out very strongly as the narrative. Na nagkakahirap kami rito, pero hindi naman ganun kasimple, nalilipat lang kami sa Saudi or sa UAE. It's very difficult to enter in those countries unless they are needed. So I think we have to put that out and to make sure that whenever crisis erupts, their well-being, their security are also protected and guaranteed by by these governments, and not always leave it all up to our own government, to our embassies and migrant worker offices. So I think mahalaga yon na sabihin sa kanilang, hello, hindi naman kami lagi dapat yung may obligasyon. I think, and they accept this in paper, but then I think we have to keep on pushing for that. And there are actually avenues to do this. Dr. Garcia is mentioning about minilaterals. In the context of labor migration, we have these minilaterals like the regional consultative processes such as the Abu Dhabi Dialogue or the Colombo Process. Abu Dhabi is an initiative of the Gulf states led by the UAE and Saudi. So maganda siyang platform to inform, to have exchanges between origin and destination countries. So I think kailangang meron tayong pagbabago ng narrative that the migrants, for one, regardless of their status, are not public wards. Hindi yan mga pabigat. So kahit yan sila undocumented, kailangan nilang magtrabaho. And what do the employers do about undocumented? Lalo pang binabarat yung sweldo. But overall, I think we know that migrants as a sector are a vulnerable population. And all the more when people who migrate do it out of compulsion or necessity. So I think it's quite important to emphasize the contribution that they do in the origin and more so also in the destination country kasi yung productive years of their lives ay doon nila ini-spend. So dapat lamang should be guarantee that their labor rights and their working and living conditions are protected as well. And we can do this bilaterally through the minilaterals or the multilateral platforms as well. And speaking of Japan, maganda yung example ni Sir Bolivar. Sa migrants din, this year, may mga efforts yung Japanese government to inform Filipinos, for example, that, oh, we want you to use the remedies that are available in Japan instead of just coming back home if they encounter problems in Japan. The other program that they are having is to promote this life-work balance for the migrants in Japan. So not only for Filipinos. So I think we need to hear more of these initiatives from the countries of destination that they are recognizing the value of economic and social contribution of the migrants in their development. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am, Sana, for highlighting the important contributions of our OFWs. And of course, that is the main reason why the government should protect our OFWs, migrant workers, especially in vulnerable areas. It's very related because if there will be conflict in Taiwan and in Korea or any parts of the world, our main concern is how to protect and repatriate our overseas Filipinos. Okay, Ambassador Lula.
Can I add a word of caution? In Japan, they need a lot of support, right? Even caregivers, but they don't get them, even housemates. How do they solve that? Humanoids. That's why Japan is number one in its, in its production of humanoids. They act as servants in the home. Creatures like R2-D2 and CP3O, remember? Those of us who belong to the Star Wars generation. So if you're looking at the humanoid production or the robotics, right? China is competing with Japan. So you better watch out. Yun lang po. Kasi baka later on, our overseas workers will be displaced by robotics. No, I'm not kidding. Yeah. So that means, kayong nasa Congress, pwede ba do something about our education, no? I mean, I know you are in a power to push for changes so that our people, if you notice, somebody made a study, our IQ is going down. Because the international average should be 100, right? The average Filipino IQ is 65. We're that low. So when people say, teach Filipinos critical thinking, I will say, how? If your IQ is 65, can you still raise the IQ? I'm always on the negative side so that we don't feel so comfortable about where we are. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Lula, for the assignment. Please remember the recommendations of Ambassador Lula. I still have a lot of questions, but there are domestic factors in the room that constrains me to ask more questions. but we will continue the discussion in the open forum. So thank you to our resource speakers. So even with this brief exchange, it's very clear how the three pillars of foreign policy are very intertwined, and the geopolitics affect the implementation of our foreign policy, and also affect our national interests. So we will continue. We will have a 10-minute break for now before we proceed with the open forum. Thank you. Okay, so welcome back. We are now on the third segment of our forum. So we are now open the floor for questions from our audience. For participants here at Nograles Hall, please feel free to raise your hand if you wish to speak. Once acknowledged, please introduce yourself with your name and institution, then proceed with your question. Please make your question brief and direct to the point. Anyone? Okay, while our participants are still processing their thoughts and formulating their questions, I will read some of the questions that were submitted online. So the first question is from Mr. Romel Cuneta. I think he is here from the House of Representatives. So this is directed to Dr. Robin Garcia. His question, sir, is what is the end goal of China based on its move, based on the move that it's doing in the region?
At the very least, I think China wants to project its power, towards other countries. It wants to make sure that it captures what we call or at least have significant influence in what we call the first island chain. It's been said that that chain that includes the Philippines is a very strategic sort of geographic location if any one country will want to control or have significant power in Indo-Pacific. So it's basically making sure. I don't want to go to argue that China wants to occupy everyone. I think that's a bit of a stretch, but it's really just having significant economic and security influence, whereby it could ensure that it could get a lot of gains in the future and secure itself in the process. So it's really power projection at the very least. Right now, it's not yet there. So the U.S. is still able to influence a lot of situations and circumstances because the U.S. can project power here in the Pacific. So for example, it has significant presence in South Korea. It has some missile systems there. And then you have the EDCA bases in the Philippines. And then you have some level of partnership between Taiwan and the U.S. Even if the U.S. adheres to the One China policy, it has a Taiwan Act that can enable the U.S. to pursue strategic ambiguity towards Taiwan. So ibig sabihin, sometimes it could invoke the One China policy and not deal with Taiwan, but in other situations it can. So that's yung sort of the policy framework that governs U.S.-Taiwan relations. So yung Taiwan Act and the One China policy. So, and then, of course, the U.S. also has some presence in Thailand. So, significant pa rin yung presence ng U.S. And I think China wants to project, power akin to how the U.S. is able to do that currently. So that's the game plan, at least in terms of the security aspect.
Okay, I think Ambassador Lula would like to add on what Professor Robin mentioned.
China doesn't want the U.S. in the Pacific area because it's thinking like this. Okay, you Americans, you stay in your part of the world. You have the Atlantic Ocean. The Pacific Ocean belongs to us. Remember when the Spanish and the Portuguese divided the world between themselves? If you've been reading the news last week, there were Chinese naval vessels that were circling is it Tasmanian Island in Australia, and the Australians were not aware of it because they were already thinking, the Australians already thinking of Asia for Asians. And for them, Australia, it's not Asia, and they're not Asians. So in effect, what they're saying, you don't belong here. And the only reason why the Australians noticed those navigating ships was a commercial airline pilot, told the control tower, do you know that there are Chinese naval vessels going around your continent? So I think if you have to take a look at that, as Dr. Garcia said, is to project power, but ultimately really to be the only power here. That's why in the negotiations on the code of conduct, isn't it? They don't like third countries, right? Yeah. So I mean, no, only people who are involved. No, other third countries should be involved. They don't like the Europeans there. They don't like the Americans. Okay.
Thank you, Ambassador Lula. And now we now have a participant, CBILLS scholar, who would like to ask question. Can you please approach the microphone near you?
Good afternoon po. I'm Cara Hernandez from the LBRMO, Senate of the Philippines. Actually, this question has been phoned in by my office mate. This is addressed to any of the panelists. While peace is always the best choice, how can the Philippines balance its ties with both the US and China while protecting our own interest in a shifting global landscape?
Okay, I think the best person to answer that is Chief of Staff Bolivar.
Tawag po dyan, voluntold daw. Well, I think thank you for the question, phone-in question po from from your colleague. I think we discussed that in some detail during the panel discussion. As long as we are guided by national interest, we could work with China on several issues. We could work with the United States on several issues. In fact, we are doing so, despite the fact that we have disputes in the South China Sea, for instance, in West Philippine Sea. We are working with China on several issues bilaterally in ASEAN, in APEC, in the United Nations, and we're doing so with the US. And they do not, these levels of cooperation that we have with both China and the US do not necessarily conflict with each other. Because at the end of the day, there are times when we have common interests. There are times when we have common goals, common needs, common aspirations. For instance, DRRM, disaster risk reduction and management. It's an interest that is common to everyone. So we have to work with all the nations that we can cooperate with in terms of we just finished a pandemic. In terms of international health emergencies, we have to work with everyone on that. So may mga ganun po. There are areas where we can work with both of them. There are areas where we can work individually with each country and with other partners, as long as it conforms to and supports our national interests. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Okay, another one.
Ma'am, just a follow-up question. Sir, as we know, there is instability in that region in the South China Sea. Can you suggest some measures in which the Philippines can engage in order to promote or contribute to regional stability? Because I believe that when there is regional stability, there will be progress, economic progress in all of the countries that are involved in the South China Sea conflict. Thank you.
I will address the question to Dr. Robin.
That's a difficult question, no? Kasi I think ayaw din naman natin maging subservient. Kung susunod lang tayo, I think dapat hindi maging dichotomy ng because we want peace. Di ba, in an abusive relationship, di ka na lang magsasalita kasi you want peace, right? So dapat di rin ganun yung sa China and in the region. I think we have to assert our rights firmly, pero hindi na naman tayo magsisimula nung away, right? So the steps that we have to take should be defensive. I understand how that could
be construed as offensive. Kaya may tinatawag na security dilemma. The more that you secure yourself materially, bases, tanks, guns, train your military alliances, it will be seen as threatening to another country, specifically China. There are ways to overcome the security dilemma. You call that concept reassurance. No? Kailangan mo sabihin na hindi naman namin to ginagawa para atakin kayo. We're doing this for our own. No? If in case something happens to us, at least we're prepared as a country. So, yan, yung reassurance and may tinatawag na costly signaling. We need to reassure our neighbors that we're not here to instigate any war. Pero at the same time, we have to firmly assert ourselves. We cannot just keep quiet.
Yes, sir.
Siguro po, if I could build on what Dr. Garcia said. In terms of the regional perspective, it was in 2017 when we were chairman, I was DFA spokesperson at the time, we were chairman of ASEAN, that we unveiled the framework of the Code of Conduct, which is now being used as the basis for the negotiation of the actual Code of Conduct. Although there are a lot of naysayers about the code, one thing is for certain, definitely Philippines will not accept a code of conduct that is not effective, that is not substantive, and that does not protect our national interest. That's always going to be a key negotiating position of the Philippines. But at the same time, siguro to level expectations, there might be some public misconception that the Code of Conduct is like a silver bullet, like an end-all and be-all. It's not going to resolve the disputes. It's going to help manage the situation in the area. So I guess to answer po yung question ninyo, that is one of the efforts that we're doing. We hope we can conclude the actual Code of Conduct when we assume the chairship of ASEAN again next year. Kasi noong 2017 po, when we were chair, we have the framework, the negotiating basis for the Code of Conduct. So hopefully, come full circle, matapos na po yung negotiations and we will have an actual code in 2026. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Yes, ma'am. The lady in brown.
Good afternoon. I'm Pamela Manalo from the Congressional Policy and Budget Research Department. It was said that our Constitution is one of the guideposts that should define our national interest. I agree. But with initiatives in Congress, no, going back and forth to change the Constitution, where one of the proposals is liberalizing ownership of land, of major industries, like media. Well, Dr. Robin mentioned that the Chinese have already engagements in industries like this in media. But more importantly, in like say ownership of of land. What do you think about these moves? Of course, these are geared towards also like liberalizing our economy, and of course there are benefits to that. But on the other side, we see all these dangers. So, what are your thoughts about this, and how should we approach this kind of proposals given the situation?
Okay, thank you, ma'am, for your question. I will address your question to Ambassador Del Rosario.
Do it the Vietnamese way and the Singaporean way. Okay. In Vietnam, private ownership, especially of land, is prohibited. In Singapore, you cannot inherit property unless it's within the 99-year lease, because they believe that land is finite, right? So if you believe in Superman, remember his advice at one point was yung kaaway niya, you want to invest in something, invest in land, because nobody can produce land. And that's very serious. So the Singaporeans, I lived there for 3 years. You can get a piece of property, you can have your own independent house there. Sorry. And you can give it to your to your descendants, and your family can own it for 99 years. On the 99th year, whoever owns it will have to surrender it back to the government. And then it will be bidded out again. All right, that's one way for people not accumulating more land than needed, isn't it? In Vietnam too, you know, you can build a condominium, you can build a shopping complex, but just ask for a 99-year lease. And then they'll give it to you. Now, one thing good about these two economies, like Vietnam, overtook us as an economy in 2022. When I was ambassador to Vietnam, I knew they would overtake us, and I was there in 2007. Sabi ko, maybe in 10 years, they'll be ahead of us. Well, it took them 15 years, but nevertheless. What is the difference? They allowed 100% equity, and they're communist. 100% equity means they will not involve in like the way we do, 60%, 40%. And if I were a businessman, why would I settle for 40%, right? I want to control my money, I want to control my business, I want to control my operations. And at the same time, that's why when Filipino businessmen went to Vietnam and they went to the embassy, they asked for advice, said, get 100% equity, huwag kang kuha ng partner na Vietnamese. Because your partner will eventually steal your technology, steal your know-how. Before you know it, you're out of your business. So the 100% equity of Singapore and Vietnam has worked. And at the same time, there are limitations on the important assets like land.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador Lula. Yes, we have one. Okay, the one at the back. Yes, yes, please.
Good afternoon.
Yes, yes.
Good afternoon. Lynette Redublo from the Senate Legislative Journal Service. For Dr. Garcia, sir, you mentioned kanina yung material buildup and the possibility of conflict, and especially nowadays, no, medyo the word war or conflict has been, been thrown around quite a lot na. I'm just curious what your thoughts are considering China's disposition and posturing. How will war look like? I mean, ano ba to? Arms war? Like, occupation, physical occupation? Is it economic? Is it social? Do we build up arms or do we create more SB19s and telenovelas for soft power? Or how kasi sir, parang with that vision, we can see how we can do the policy, diba? Parang, I guess, parang ganun.
Yes, thank you for the question. I understand the concern. Kaya nga, complicated talaga yung foreign policy making eh. And I'm sure our eminent panel can attest to that. But maybe I could say that it's all of it. So, for example, sa economic part, we really should strengthen our economy. In fact, in the literature of international politics, may tinatawag na internal balancing. Kasi yan yung source ng pagbili mo, pag-project mo ng power abroad if malakas yung economy mo on your own, that you don't have to depend on a lot of countries. No? Kaya yung export-orientedness ng Japan and South Korea is important for perhaps to be a model for us. No? So strengthen your economy kasi that will affect your ability to pursue security and autonomy in the world. No? And then of course, yung sabi nga ni sa Department of Foreign Affairs, the word we're developing soft power. That's also very important. And yung concept ng power is making people do things or entities do things that they would otherwise do. So it will give us a lot of influence if they agree with our morality, if they agree with our positions. No? So maybe aside from the military, which we definitely should strengthen, and we're very, very far from strength. Other aspects are also important. And Kaya nga, yung foreign policy is not just about defense and not just about guns and all of those things. It's also about soft power and diplomacy. It's also about economic strength. Kaya nga, totoo talaga na politics, economics, the global and domestic are intimately intertwined. And we have to consider all of those fears as we create our own policies, no? And project our influence abroad.
Sir, as a follow-up lang po, in connection with strengthening our economic stance, our economic status, I was lucky enough to be with the CBILLS program. In 2023, we went to Malaysia, and they mentioned that Singapore and Malaysia are kind of like tinkering on the possibility of the ASEAN having an EU set up. Will that be helpful to us in the context of?
Ambassador Laura can probably.
Okay, I think it's impossible. Because for one thing, the EU, just the currency, single currency, Singapore wouldn't allow that. They wouldn't allow that, right? At the same time, the Europeans all have one culture. They're all Christians. We are, Buddhists, Muslim, Christians, and Hindus, right, in Indonesia. But let me throw back a question at you, based on the previous question. If you were the Chinese, will you invade the Philippines?
Would you like to answer? Or ma'am, is it a rhetoric question?
Ma'am, parang...
Who would dare to answer?
Ma'am,
Civil
parang-
scholars?
You might get the answers from your own answers. Will you invade the Philippines if you are China? How many of you will say yes? Raise your hands. You won't, right? Why? Because we're hard to govern. Remember, the Americans gave us up for one very... No, I'm not kidding. Why did we not... It's not pasaway. Because we're too many. The reason why did not become the 49th state of the United States? Because had we become a state of the U.S., and representation is based on population, 1/4 of the U.S. Congress would be Filipinos. No, I'm not kidding, right? So the more the state has a population, the more representatives. That's why California, I think, is it California, which is the biggest number? Yeah, number of congressmen in the U.S. So that's why, yeah, right. So it's, and then the electoral college. Can you imagine eventually the Speaker of the House will be a Filipino? Wow, that would really be, that would really be unprecedented. Now, this is a joke that was going around in my group because we were very naughty. We're doing security and defense. Remember the U.S. wants Canada to be the 51st state. Right? He said, I want Canada to become the 51st state. One Filipino said, why don't we revive the statehood movement? Remember that? Ilan sa inyong buhay na noon? There was a statehood movement in 1970. Okay, what was it about? Yeah, we wanted to become the 51st state of the U.S. We suppose the U.S. paid attention to us now. Even the Americans don't like us.
Okay,
Tapos
thank
na yung
you.
question ninyo.
Okay, I will just read one question from... okay, sir. Okay, sir.
I just wanted to, hindi yung if I were China, will I invite the Philippines? But to answer your question po, or to try to answer your question about, kasi ang laki po ng differences between ASEAN and the European Union. First and foremost, when both institutions were established, the European Union is a product of World War II. And the primary reason when it started as the European Steel and Coal Community, the primary reason was to prevent a remilitarization of Germany. Kaya kunin nila yung strategic assets, which is steel and coal. Tapos from there, naging European Common Market, naging European Customs Union, etc. ASEAN was created in the Cold War to try to, in a way, siguro to not be aligned with either the US or the Soviet Union. Pangalawa po, in terms of culture, ang Europeans are very normative eh. They like their laws, they like their regulations. Kaya nga po, in the EU, yun po yung pinag-usapan namin when I was posted in Brussels. Even yung size ng kamatis, meron silang batas tungkol dyan. Meron silang regulation. I don't see ASEAN doing that. Na, oy, masyadong malaki yung kamatis na binibenta mo, Malaysia or whatever. Meron pong ganun. So, in terms of history, in terms of culture, in terms of values, it's going to be very difficult. And I don't think ASEAN wants to be a European Union type institution. It's more flexible that way for us kasi nga po yung ating decision-making process, etc.
And then to add to that, because Dr. Garcia has been talking about the alignment of Malaysia and Indonesia and Singapore, right, with China. Guess where Xi Jinping is going next week? He's going to Malaysia and Indonesia. See? Sakto, right? So China is supporting these two economies. And at the same time, Indonesia is starting to be more or less militarily oriented, right? Because the president just passed a legislation that will allow the generals to be part of the civil authority of their government. And Malaysia is becoming rich. So in other words, we are not developing the same as the EU. And at the same time, to me, if you ask me, do I believe in ASEAN? Frankly, I've lost faith in ASEAN.
Thank you. Thank you for your thoughts and for your perspectives. I will just read one question from Mr. Albert Basa from the Senate of the Philippines. His question is directed to Ms. Ellen Sana. After 3 years since the enactment of the DMW law, and given the global changes affecting migration and employment of Filipinos abroad, do you think we have established enough safeguards, particularly the provision of Action Fund for repatriating OFWs?
Okay, thank you for the question. I think I would say that we have an action fund, but will that be sufficient to cover any and all contingencies for our overseas Filipino workers? I'm not sure about that. So that's the first one. The second is, I think one of the things that I want to actually say here also is that DMW being the youngest department, where the mandate is to address any and all concerns of migrants at all stages of the migration cycle, as they say, including on-site, I think they would need to capacitate themselves, especially in performing their tasks abroad, because they will be embracing some of the functions that used to be under the OMWA and the ATN of the OMWA. So I think there should be also a lot of close coordination with the DFA. Parang bunsong kapatid na kailangang i-mentor, especially in relating with the host governments. Kasi nga sila yung front runner doon dahil equal body na yung DFA and DMW. So I think it's quite important that they deliver to the task. Truth be told, we had a lot of reservations during the deliberation of the DMW bill, but now that it is a law, then of course we have to give it a chance to see how it will actually improve the situation, the governance after 50 years. So let's see.
Thank you, Executive Director Sana. I think Ma'am Jana would like to ask a question.
So good afternoon. I'm Jana Oliadas from the Committee Affairs Department of the House of Representatives. So I'd like to, my take-off point would be the point where Dr. Garcia talked about securitizing economics, and he said, you can't let China take control of your critical infrastructure. The thing is, they're already here, and we know that NGCP, for example, in the energy sector, the chair is actually a Chinese. And not only that, in the investigation of our Quad Committee, we found out that using fraudulent birth certificates, the Chinese have actually acquired a vast tracts of land. So how do you even and do that. So when you mentioned that there is a need to strengthen governance, and one of that is working on the institutions. But what I've heard so far from you are, one, like putting your spending on the Navy rather than the AFP, for example, or the Foreign Investments Act. You can work on the List C. But for the Foreign Investments Act, Congress is done with that, no? So it's in place. And for List C, for example, you only need NEDA to work on the areas that are still with Filipino control. So, and the effect, of course, is perspective. So having said all this, we're at this stage in the House of Rep where we're preparing the legislative agenda for the 20th Congress. And some of those that you mentioned were more of the executive side. So for the legislative agenda of the 20th Congress, what would you suggest as critical pieces of legislation that the legislative branch need to work on this so-called strengthening governance and building on the institutions?
Thank you po for the question. Big discussion on economic security. Maybe I'll just say that teka, maraming questions eh. Yung una po is yung sa NGCP. What I know is that the Maharlika Fund has proposed or has already concluded the negotiations in buying the 40% from the NGCP. And nakita ko po yung sa Quadcom nga na hearing, I think there was 1 to 2 whole days about it, na even the chairperson is Chinese. So, I'm not sure how that's possible, to be honest. I don't know if it's a loophole in legislation, but that's one. Yung, especially for countries we have a conflict of interest in. It's not an easy thing to write in legislation, I know. Pero yun, maybe it's something we can explore whether foreigners could serve as chairman. Yung second that I want to mention is yung Public Services Act. Actually, there's a provision, and you know this better than I do, there's a provision for national security review, no, for all investments coming in. I know that was the version in the Senate that was passed. Of course, it's already law. Nakasama na yun na napirmahan. I am not sure if we've ever convened that review board or what kind of institution is necessary to convene that. But maybe it's a separate interagency board altogether na mas ma-activate. If it has never met, maybe it's time to meet. And and see whether or not how vulnerable we are. Actually, sa academic side, because I'm also a professor at the Ateneo School of Government. I recently joined this year as associate professor. I know that there's a big gap in the literature, that no one has studied the level of economic vulnerability of the Philippines towards other countries. So, kumbaga, studying the economic structure from a political perspective, hindi pa siya napag-aaralan ng maayos. So I think ngayon we can get experts from PIDS, from NEDA to sort of help us see the bigger the puzzle. But I think the government could commission a study on this, and convene an eminent panel of experts to study economic vulnerability, because it is an issue. It will be an issue in light of the trade war and all other things. But it begins really with this recognition that economics and politics are not separate spheres. That economic vulnerability, that China can weaponize foreign direct investments. That FDIs are not always neutral and not always good. There might be some aspects that we have to sort of be more cautious about. Maybe in terms of we did also propose to the House as Congressional Research Fellows, kami nga ni Professor Roman Kraft. Hindi ko alam kung umabot sa inyo, baka hindi. No? Pero yung unang-una po namin sinabi doon is legislate a
a integrated China policy. We have the National Security Plan and the National Security Strategy promulgated by our NSC, of course in coordination with other agencies such as DFA, DND, and other security agencies. But that's a broad plan. We don't have a plan dedicated to China, and other countries have that. They have a China policy, no? That will outline all of these things, no? From economic to democracy to its participation in the economy, what have you. So baka it's time for us in this next Congress to maybe explore that idea. So yun lang po.
Thank you. Okay, Ambalula.
May I add to that? This is personal, all right? So don't shoot me if you don't agree with my ideology. To me, the Local Government Act is really counterproductive to security because now you're leaving every local executive to determine its own interests economically. That's why we have some governors or mayors who can easily be enticed to allow investments to come in, and you cannot blame them. They want to develop their community, their local jurisdiction. That's why you have some provinces that are pro-China because the Chinese invested there. So if you're talking about securitizing investment, it's a big job. We have so many, how many barangays do we have? How many mayors do you have? That means you have to convert everybody to think in terms of security. But if they're thinking of economic security, that's another battle because that's what they're thinking of. Second, you have to think also of our parties where there is no platform. You all know you're in Congress. Do you suppose political dynasties are good for security management? Okay, as I said, don't report me to your congressman, okay? But what I'm trying to say is that, remember I said national interest versus personal interest. So now we have a dominance of personal interests, right? So our problem is really deeply rooted. So I wish I didn't attend this forum. It makes me more frustrated right now. I'm supposed to retire in peace, okay?
Okay, thank you, Ambassador Lula. We still have time for one more question. Okay. Okay.
Good afternoon po. I am Maan Salado from the Senate of the Philippines. So, lately po, may issue na umiikot po sa balibalita natin na sinabi daw ni AFP Chief of Staff Romeo Browner sa isang speech sa Northern Luzon Command sa Tarlac for them to get ready kung sakaling i-invade ng China ang Taiwan because merong mga exercises ang China along sa straits na malapit sa Taiwan wherein they brought in considerable number of assets. They are thinking that it is a prelude to an attack. Now, the AFP says that this is just a precautionary measure na kailangan maghanda. And the first question is this just a mere strategy of the AFP, which you can call communication activism? And if such is so, ano po kaya yung magiging epekto ni ito sa ating mga OFWs na mare-red alert? Halimbawa, for example, kung ako po ay engineer at pinaplano ko sa mga panahon na ito ay mag-a-apply po, palipad na sana ako ng Taiwan, baka mamaya hindi po ako makalipad. Yun lang po yung question ko po.
Okay, we can direct the question to Chief of Staff Bolivar and then to Ma'am Ellen sana.
Thank you po. Pahirap yung tanong.
Interesting times.
Siguro po, with regard to AFP Chief of Staff's statement, I cannot, the DFA cannot speak for the AFP, so I guess it's better to ask them. But definitely, as a former spokesperson, I know there is a context to this. There's a context to that. There's an event that he spoke to. Maybe yung buong part ng speech niya. If it was part of a speech, there's an antecedent and a precedent dun sa speech na yun. Maybe he was talking about we need to be ready to mobilize in case we need to evacuate our Filipinos because let's face it, despite its shortcomings, only our military has the lift capability to evacuate 200,000 po, no? 200,000 Filipinos out of Taiwan in case of any eventuality. So maybe yun po ang context niya. I'm just offering my personal opinion. Ngayon po, in terms of, kunyari pupunta kayo ng Taiwan ngayon, unless there's a travel advisory that's issued by the government, I don't think there should be any concern. Kagaya po ng, alam po ni ex-dear, sana po yun, meron tayong levels, alert levels. Even alert level 1 is just a precautionary phase. It doesn't mean you have to restrict your travel to wherever country that is. It just means be cautious, be alert with the news, etc. Pag alert level 4 na yan, uwian na kayo lahat. Pero if it hasn't come to that, then there is no travel advisory. Then I don't see why not. You should enjoy your travel to wherever you want to go.
Executive Director.
Siguro dagdag, we were discussing about this nung merienda time. It is reassuring for me, halimbawa na parang ang posibleng scenario, wala namang outright na war. Sabi nga ni Dr. Garcia, pwedeng merong silang pro-China, ganyan. So, pero of course, siguro sa context ni AFP Chief, dapat ready tayo. Pero yung emphasis niya is on the strength, peace through strength. Na I'm not sure about that. Pero yung point ng, as far as the OFWs are concerned, I think, related to the question kanina na, are we ready for that? Lagi naman yatang ready. Especially because most of our OFWs are in conflict areas. So, Middle East, doon pa, parang sanay na nga, naka-standby sila eh. So, but can we manage to evacuate ASAP, yung more than 200, baka pwede pa rin. So, yun nga, hopefully, hindi naman open hostilities na sana na pati civilians will be in the crossfire. But I think yung mas alarming for me that I heard from Dr. Garcia is yung security threat na ang lapit lang natin sa Taiwan, yung Kaohsiung, tapos sa Cagayan ba yun, na pwedeng gawing staging ground yon ng China na naman, incursion ng China sa Pilipinas. Of course, not that the Chinese are not in our midst already, pero yun, yung may ganun pang scenario. But as far as the migrants are concerned, parang yung mga, like yung people the migrants in Lebanon and in other places na palaging may gera, parang minsan nagpa-party doon sa isang kalye, nagigera. So parang minsan, for those of us in the Philippines, mas alarm tayo on what's happening. Pero I think for those who are there, medyo may alam nila ano yung protocols na pwede nilang gawin. Ganon din dun sa mga tao sa Lebanon eh. So as Sir Bolivar said, if you have plans to go to Taiwan, then ituloy mo lang. And enjoy. At lagi naman yung, hindi naman siguro mangyayari yun sa akin. You remember when we stopped deployment in Libya, nagkaroon ng delegation sa Congress after 1 year, begging Congress to lift the ban. Kasi payag na silang, anong sabi nila, common na statement nila, okay nang makaharap sa bala kaysa mamatay ng nagugutom dito. And again, that's a very sad statement for a people. At sana ay makinig ang ating gobyerno. Thank you.
I always like to think out of the box, okay? Sa akin, if I were Browner, I'm in the AFP, I will not worry perhaps at the military equipment that's being prepared for an attack. I will worry about a Filipino being held hostage. Remember, we gave up our participation in the war in Iraq, the coalition on the willing, because of Angelo de la Cruz. Just think of 10 Filipinos being held hostage by the Chinese in Taiwan. So, and they say, if you fight, you join the Americans in fighting us, we'll kill all the Filipino hostages one by one. Just think of that. Diba? Dapat our military should think, they should not think in terms of, just outright killing. There are many ways of skinning a cat.
Okay, thank you. That wraps up our open forum, but we will devote the remaining a few minutes for our speakers to provide us with the closing reflections and policy recommendation. Sirs and ma'am, these are the right people where you can lobby for your policy advocacies. This is also the right time because we are already preparing for the 20th Congress. So let's start with very short, brief policy recommendation.
No, I think marami na rin po ako sinabi kanina. So, siguro I just wanna say na yung foreign affairs, global politics is complicated. It's more complex than we think. And I hope more and more people study it. And more legislation is dedicated towards it. And then maybe the second is yung China policy, or even something broader. What is our policy towards this changing world? Even if it's just a statement of how we see the world, I think that's important. So, yun lang po. Thank you.
Sir?
Siguro po marami na rin nasabi kanina, no? But one thing I would like to leave a message to the group is, kasi minsan diplomacy, diplomats get a bad rap kasi puro kwentuhan kayo, puro usap-usapan lang kayo, puro conferences. But remember, it's better to talk than to go to war. Diba? Talking, it's not just trying to delay the inevitable, but it's trying to understand each other. Because if there's some sort of understanding, then maybe, just maybe we can find common ground, maybe we can find a better way out of any impasse. I remember, siguro just to bring in, dahil pinopromote po namin ngayon yung soft power roadmap, which was recently approved. So we're now trying to be more aggressive in promoting Philippine soft power, and we would hope that our Congress would help in that respect. Kasi as of now, it's just the executive branch crafting the soft power roadmap. But I remember I was also an alumni of the APCSS back in 2000, the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu. And you bring there all of these leaders of the military, all of these leaders of foreign affairs. One of our classmates became the foreign minister of Micronesia, yung ganong klase. So networking, we were just talking, we were just spitballing about policy options, regional security, etc. But then, eventually, it becomes a platform for networking with future leaders, networking with people who might have influence in their respective governments in the future, if not currently. So let's always keep in mind, importante rin po yung nag-uusap tayo, importante rin po yung nag-exchange tayo ng information at nagkukwentuhan tayo dahil doon tayo makakahanap ng mas magandang paraan para doon sa masolusyonan yung kung anumang problema meron tayo.
Okay, in 2015, when we hosted APEC, I was the senior official in charge of all the meetings. And it was during our hosting when we introduced the concept of the blue economy. Nobody knew at that time what it meant. In our mind, the blue economy is not just using the ocean and the waters to build wealth, but it's also greening the blue economy, meaning conserving it, preserving it for the next generation. You have to consider the fact that the Philippines is becoming smaller in size because of climate change. Those of you from Batangas all the way along the coastlines, I think the water has moved by at least 100 meters, right, inward. I have some friends who have homes in Pangasinan, in La Union, and Batangas. Their rest houses, they're gone already. So it's really serious, but people are not focusing on this. So if you focus on the blue economy, knowing that we are more water than land, and see how you can develop our waters, especially our internal waters, to generate more livelihood, so that our Filipinos abroad will get something, if they go home because of this, evolving geopolitics. And at the same time, we can develop our own food security. Remember this also, I was ambassador to Vietnam, and at that time, I was aware of the yearly annual importation of Vietnamese rice, 1.2 metric tons a year. At one point, I was called by the Vietnamese foreign minister, and he said, Ambassador, he said, remember, we are providing you rice because of our commitment in terms of our agreement with your president. At that time, the president was GMA. But remember this, please tell your president, if ever there's going to be drought, if ever there's going to, due to climate change, too much water or no water, he said, we will feed our people first before we send you anything. So think about that. Maybe we may not eat rice, but we may eat a lot of fish, but at least we will survive with the blue economy.
The Committee Secretary of the Economic Affairs is here. For they're handling the blue economy law.
Yung migration is a global phenomenon that many countries view as something that may undermine their sovereignty. So kasi for the longest time, from katapos ng gera, hindi ako masyadong marunong doon sa history, but the point is, yung pag-create ng nation states and the laws are made to protect the rights of the nationals, etc., na challenge yan ngayon. This is being put to test with all this population or people crossing borders and moving to other places. Not only yung refugees or asylum seekers, pero yun, for economic reasons, which as I said earlier, hindi naman dahil wala tayong matrabaho dito, but they need us, so they open the doors for this migrant labor. So I think yung isang issue doon ay, how do governments deal with this? For the longest time, we've been trying to get the UN to put it in the agenda of the UN, but the most that they can come up with ay itong Global Compact for Migration, which is a framework for international migration, pero it took so many years to build on this. At ang Pilipinas is one of the active member states of the UN to make it a reality. So, pero that said, our migrants continue to be vulnerable to a lot of abuses, whether in the workplaces or in the destinations that they are living in. Kaya lamang yung ding isang challenge is we make a lot of demands to destination countries, pero yung ating sariling gobyerno ay hindi rin ganon ka-friendly to migrant workers who are coming in our countries. Na-expose ito when we were having all these hearings about the POGOs. So, siguro for our legislators, I think, well, one, migrant issues are intersectional. So, hindi lang yan usapin ng workers na nandoon, but they are women there. And I would say, our laws we have good laws. Even if we have bad laws, we have good laws as well. So, on women, on gender equality, and on migrant workers. Kaya hindi na kami masyadong naglalabi for new laws eh. But what is the problem? Implementation, funding allocation, at saka yun, magpapadala ka, we deployed the highest number last year. Noong 2023, ang figure was, we deployed the highest in 2023, all-time high. Nung tinignan ko yung figure ng 2024, all-time high pa rin, mas mataas ng from 2023. So ganun pa rin ang trend after 50 years. At yung in terms of the profile, yun nga, very vulnerable pa rin kasi low-wage occupations, etc. So I think magandang i-revisit from time to time yung mga batas. Hindi halimbawa, may namatay sila Ranara, laging magde-deployment ban. This state policy of deployment ban, of course, we respect that. Pero sana hindi parang maya-maya ay nagde-deployment ban tayo. Kasi it really creates tension in our relations with countries of destination. So baka mas merong long-lasting na policy para hindi palaging yun ang ginagamit. Parang rubber na, oops, balikan ulit. Tapos sunod, mag-i-impose na naman ng ban. So I think that's something that we have to think about. And then make sure that the laws are really implemented. One thing we realize dito sa access to justice, mabilis gumampan yung gobyerno ng pag-evacuate, pag-repatriate, lahat ng cost natin. But then there are the underlying causes on why they needed to be repatriated dahil salba yung employer nila, hindi sila pinapasweldo, and all those things, hindi yung na-address. That is not just. That is not the way we should view these things. So sana gamitin, yun yung isang advocacy namin, gamitin ng workers yung mga batas. Kasi there are good laws, there are good provisions. And at the same time, really continue to put pressure on the destination country to do their share. Kasi sobra na silang nakinabang for the longest time. But I think it will take a lot of political will also on our part. Siguro after more than 50 years, we should have that confidence na mag-negotiate ng fairly for our migrant workers. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much to our esteemed panelists for contributing significantly to our discussion for today. Let's give them another well-deserved round of applause. So we look forward to continuing the dialogue in future sessions of Thursday Talks. Thank you, everyone, and I now give the floor back to our host, Ms. Ria.
Thank you, Comsec Villasante, for guiding us through our first session, panel discussion, and of course, the open forum. At this point, we have a very short activity for our attendees, just so we can hear from all for one last time. May we ask everyone to input your key takeaway from today's lecture by clicking on the link in your Viber group or using the QR code found on your table. So we'd like for everyone to reflect on our afternoon and answer this burning question. So if you were to tweet about today's lecture, what would you say? So again, the burning question is, if you were to tweet about today's lecture, what would you say? So as everyone shares their answer, the program team will be displaying your real-time responses on the screen through Menti. So kindly key in your key takeaways or key takeaway in this lecture series.
200 characters.
So, not 200 characters, but only word or two po will do.
Walang 200 characters na doon. Menti, ano lang.
Alright, so let's see what are the words that you key in. So it could be a word or words. So let's see. Alright, so far these are some of the words statement that we have. So our national interest must be our first priority to navigate these unpredictable global shifts. Okay, so we also have here some hashtags, so it's really a tweet. National interest over personal interest. So, with a lot of exclamation point. All right, we have another one. Self-preservation is the key. So we also have another interesting words here. Alisto Pilipinas. Okay. So I guess these are just some of the words that you actually key in. So now to give the synthesis of today's discussion, we would like to call again our moderator, Committee Secretary Jonalyn Villasante. Ma'am.
So good afternoon once again. Today's forum has powerfully illuminated the complex interplay between global geopolitical shifts and the Philippines' foreign policy directions. Drawing from Dr. Garcia's incisive analysis, we were reminded that the country sits at the heart of an evolving strategic landscape marked by intensifying great power rivalries, institutional realignments, and shifting public sentiment. He has called to think critically and systematically about these developments, particularly the multidimensional China challenge, set the tone for a robust and grounded exchange. During the panel discussion, we deepened our understanding of how these shifts affect key foreign policy pillars. Ambassador Laura Del Rosario emphasized the urgency of economic resilience, especially in the light of shrinking foreign aid and increasingly transactional geopolitics. Her insights underscored the need for the Philippines to diversify partnerships and invest in self-reliant economic and development strategies. Remember, it's trade and not aid. Mr. Bolivar offered an important reflection on geopolitical balancing, noting that strategic autonomy need not mean equidistance, but clarity of national interests anchored in constitutional values, regional responsibility, and long-term stability. Executive Director Sana highlighted the direct human impact of geopolitics on overseas Filipinos, raising the need for proactive labor diplomacy, reintegration support, and protection mechanisms. She pointed to the importance of multilateral cooperation and, if possible, the creation of minilateralism in addressing and protecting the needs and protecting our overseas Filipinos. The Open Forum reaffirmed that the boundaries between national security, economic diplomacy, and the protection of Filipino migrants are increasingly porous. Participants reflected on the importance of building state capacity, strategic foresight, and consistent international engagement to navigate these turbulent times. In conclusion, this dialogue made clear that foreign policy must be anticipatory, integrated, and grounded in both national realities and global responsibilities. I also took note by heart some of the policy recommendations of our panelists, which fall under the jurisdiction of the Committee on, some of their recommendations fall under the jurisdiction of the Committee on Foreign Affairs. So, with that, thank you for being part of this inaugural lecture series of the Development Academy of the Philippines. Thank you.
This has truly been an insightful afternoon. We've explored a complex and timely topic, unpacking the concept of security at the national, regional, and global level, exploring nuances through a rich exchange of ideas. Discussions like this remind us the importance of continuously engaging with pressing issues, questioning assumptions, and seeking ways to refine our perspectives. Of course, none of this would have been possible without the expertise and generosity of our session speaker and panel discussants who shared their insights to help us navigate today's lecture topic. We are also deeply grateful to our lecture moderator who skillfully guided today's lecture, ensuring that key points were explored and that meaningful dialogue took place. With that, the Development Academy of the Philippines would like to give a token of our appreciation to today's resource persons. May I call on stage Center for Governance Vice President Imelda Caluen and CBILLS Program Manager Ms. Maria Zarina Crisha de Leon to present our tokens. First, our session speaker, Dr. Robin Michael Garcia. Ambassador Laura Quimbao del Rosario, Mr. Robespierre Bolivar, and Ms. Ellen Sana, and Committee Secretary Jonalyn Vicente.